Welcome to Geothink.ca's video interview. This month we bring you an interview with Teresa Scassa, Canada Research Chair in Information Law at the University of Ottawa.
It lays out the government strategy for how it intends to proceed with open government. And open government, has a number of different aspects to it. And the federal government has identified, open access or access to government information, open data, and also open participation. So there are those different dimensions to it. And so there are questions, I think, about how that's going to happen, where the priorities are going to be, what needs to happen for that to take place. And so it's certainly been commented that, I think the review done for the Open Government Partnership by Mary Francoli observed that the emphasis in the action plan is very heavily on open data. And so I think that's a factor, and that's interesting. I mean, there are things that need to be considered on the open access front. And again, there have been plenty of commentators and critics that have indicated that there's not going to be a lot of improvement on open access until the government actually tackles reform of the access to information law. So that, there are laws that already govern these areas, but, in the case of the federal government, it's the Access to Information Act, and it's significantly out of date. It needs reform. There's stuff in the action plan around improving access to information, but a lot of it's about, creating an online system for making demands, or it's not that these are unimportant things, but they are things that are on the margins of the core issues. So now it's easier to fill out the form for the request, but are you going to get your information?
Yeah.
The Access to Information Commissioner has been quite vocal about some of the constraints and the issues that are affecting her work and her ability to do her work. But there are concerns, for example, about the scope of some of the exceptions to access and the ways in which, in fact, the government is able to restrict access to documents that many people argue should be accessible to the public, using some of the exceptions that are in the legislation and some of the ways in which they've been interpreted. So there are questions as to whether the Act, for example, really creates the appropriate boundaries for access to information. There are also, and these are not necessarily legislative, but they are important issues for access to information. There are issues about the cost of access. There are issues about the speed of the process, and there have been real concerns of late about how slow government has been to respond, or some departments or agencies have been to respond to particular complaints. There have been concerns about the commissioners very recently expressed concerns about her own budget and the ability to meet the increased level of complaints and concerns and the demands on her office. There's always talk about proactive disclosure and about the pressure on government departments to disclose information that is regularly sought through access to information applications, and to, instead of just wait, on more of a pull model where people have to go and ask for that information, that agencies and departments start to identify information that's high demand, important to citizens, and actually to just put that out there on their websites or through a portal, so that citizens can get access to it quickly without having to go through the access to information process. And that will be good, as it evolves, but that's still a work in progress as well. That's why projects like Geothink are so important, because you've got researchers looking at a whole range of different issues around public participation, around the uptake and use of this information, because fundamentally it's very complex, and there's open data or open access And then there's open data and open access. I mean, you can
Sure.
put a whole bunch of data sets out there, but if they're poorly indexed and difficult to find, and in incompatible formats, and the licenses from one jurisdiction to another are incompatible, the open licenses, and cause problems, then it's not, it's not great. If the metadata is poor, then the use of the data may be flawed or problematic. The same thing with access to information. If you have the laws in place, but the commissioner has no money or no budget, then and there's a culture that is resistant, then you're not going to have, you have it on paper, but you don't actually have it in practice. So
Sure.
there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of thinking to be done, a lot of policy to study, and there's, in some cases there need to be cultural shifts and cultural changes in terms of how things are done. There's also the digital literacy piece. There needs to be the skills not just to use the technologies, but also to understand the data and understand how to work with the data and what the limitations of the data are. So it's a very, very complex project. And I think that the federal government has identified and is tackling a number of these different issues.
Sure.
But there's so many of them.
Yeah.
And so, this is going to be a work in progress and an ongoing process. And again, the kind of work that we're doing through Geothink, and perhaps through other similar projects, is going to be important in terms of just, providing insight into different aspects of the problem, providing critical reflection on some of the different issues.